Chapter 6. Pig and Pepper. For a minute or two she stood looking at the house and wondering what to do next, when suddenly a footman in livery came running out of the wood. She considered him to be a footman because he was in livery. Otherwise, judging by his face only, she would have called him a fish, and rapped loudly at the door with his knuckles. It was opened by another footman in livery, with a round face and large eyes like a frog, and both footmen, Alice noticed, had powdered hair that curled all over their heads. She felt very curious to know what it was all about, and crept a little way out of the wood to listen. The fish footman began by producing from under his arm a great letter, nearly as large as himself, and this he handed over to the other, saying in a solemn tone,
"For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet."
The frog footman repeated in the same solemn tone, only changing the order of the words a little.
From the Queen, an invitation for the Duchess to play croquet.
Then they both bowed low, and their curls got entangled together. Alice laughed so much at this that she had to run back into the wood for fear of their hearing her, and when she next peeped out, the fish footman had gone, and the other was sitting on the ground near the door, staring stupidly into the sky. Alice went timidly up to the door and knocked.
There's no sort of use in knocking,
said the footman.
And that for two reasons. First, because I'm on the same side of the door as you are. Secondly, because they're making such a noise inside, no one could possibly hear you.
And certainly there was a most extraordinary noise going on within, a constant howling and sneezing, and every now and then a great crash, as if a dish or kettle had been broken to pieces. "Please, then," said Alice, "how am I to get in?"
"There might be some sense in your knocking,"
the footman went on without attending to her.
"If we had the door between us. For instance, if you were inside, you might knock, and I could let you out, you know."
He was looking up into the sky all the time he was speaking, and this Alice thought decidedly uncivil. But perhaps he can't help it, she said to herself. His eyes are so very nearly at the top of his head, but at any rate he might answer questions. "How am I to get in?" she repeated aloud.
"I shall sit here," the footman remarked, "till tomorrow."
At this moment the door of the house opened, and a large plate came skimming out straight at the footman's head. It just grazed his nose and broke to pieces against one of the trees behind him.
"Or next day, maybe," the footman continued in the same tone, exactly as if nothing had happened.
"How am I to get in?" asked Alice again in a louder tone.
"Are you to get in at all?" said the footman. "That's the first question, you know."
It was, no doubt, only Alice did not like to be told so. "It's really dreadful," she muttered to herself, "the way all the creatures argue. It's enough to drive one crazy." The footman seemed to think this a good opportunity for repeating his remark with variations.
"I shall sit here," he said, "on and off, for days and days."
"But what am I to do?" said Alice.
"Anything you like," said the footman, and began whistling.
"Oh, there's no use talking to him," said Alice desperately. "He's perfectly idiotic." And she opened the door and went in. The door led right into a large kitchen, which was full of smoke from one end to the other. The Duchess was sitting on a three-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby. The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron which seemed to be full of soup.
"Oh, there's certainly too much pepper in that soup,"
Alice said to herself as well as she could for sneezing. There was certainly too much of it in the air. Even the Duchess sneezed occasionally. And as for the baby, it was sneezing and howling alternately without a moment's pause. The only two creatures in the kitchen that did not sneeze were the cook and a large cat which was lying on the hearth and grinning from ear to ear. "Please, would you tell me," said Alice a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners for her to speak first, "why your cat grins like that?"
It's the Cheshire cat," said the Duchess. "And that's why. Pig."
She said the last word with such sudden violence that Alice quite jumped, but she saw in another moment that it was addressed to the baby, and not to her, so she took courage and went on again. "I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know that cats could grin."
"Oh, they all can," said the Duchess. "And most of them do."
"I don't know of any that do," Alice said very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation.
"Well, you don't know much," said the Duchess, "and that's a fact."
Alice did not at all like the tone of this remark, and thought it would be as well to introduce some other subject of conversation. While she was trying to fix on one, the cook took the cauldron of soup off the fire, and at once set to work throwing everything within her reach at the Duchess and the baby. The fire irons came first, then followed a shower of saucepans, plates, and dishes. The Duchess took no notice of them, even when they hit her, and the baby was howling so much already that it was quite impossible to say whether the blows hurt it or not. "Oh, please mind what you're doing," cried Alice, jumping up and down in an agony of terror. "Oh, there goes his precious nose," as an unusually large saucepan flew close by it and very nearly carried it off.
"If everybody minded their own business,"
the Duchess said in a hoarse growl,
"the world would go round a great deal faster than it does."
"Which would not be an advantage," said Alice, who felt very glad to get an opportunity of showing off a little of her knowledge. "Just think what work it would make with the day and night. You see, the earth takes 24 hours to turn round on its axis."
"Talking of axes," said the Duchess, "chop off her head."
Alice glanced round anxiously at the cook to see if she meant to take the hint, but the cook was busily stirring the soup and seemed not to be listening, so she went on again. 24 hours, I think, or is it 12?
"Oh, don't bother me," said the Duchess. "I never could abide figures."
And with that she began nursing her child again, singing a sort of lullaby to it as she did so, and giving it a violent shake at the end of every line.
"Speak roughly to your little boy, and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy, because he knows it teases."
Chorus, in which the cook and the baby joined.
"Wah, wah, wah."
While the Duchess sang the second verse of the song, she kept tossing the baby violently up and down, and the poor little thing howled so that Alice could hardly hear the words.
"I speak severely to my boy. I beat him when he sneezes, for he can thoroughly enjoy the pepper when he pleases."
Chorus.
"Wah, wah, wah." "Here, you may nurse it a bit, if you like,"
the Duchess said to Alice, flinging the baby at her as she spoke.
"I must go and get ready to play croquet with the Queen."
And she hurried out of the room. The cook threw a frying pan after her as she went, but it just missed her. Alice caught the baby with some difficulty, as it was a queer-shaped little creature and held out its arms and legs in all directions. "Just like a starfish," thought Alice. The poor little thing was snorting like a steam engine when she caught it, and kept doubling itself up and straightening itself out again, so that altogether for the first minute or two it was as much as she could do to hold it. As soon as she had made out the proper way of nursing it, which was to twist it up into a sort of knot and then keep tight hold of its right ear and left foot so as to prevent its undoing itself, she carried it out into the open air. "If I don't take this child away with me," thought Alice, "they're sure to kill it in a day or two. Wouldn't it be murder to leave it behind?" She said the last words out loud, and the little thing grunted in reply. It had left off sneezing by this time. "Don't grunt," said Alice. "That's not at all the proper way of expressing yourself." The baby grunted again, and Alice looked very anxiously into its face to see what was the matter with it. There could be no doubt that it had a very turn-up nose, much more like a snout than a real nose. Also, its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby. Altogether, Alice did not like the look of the thing at all. But perhaps it was only sobbing, she thought, and looked into its eyes again to see if there were any tears. No, there were no tears. "If you're going to turn into a pig, my dear," said Alice seriously, "I'll have nothing more to do with you. Mind now." Poor little thing sobbed again, or grunted, it was impossible to say which, and they went on for some while in silence. Alice was just beginning to think to herself, "Now what am I to do with this creature when I get it home?" when it grunted again, so violently that she looked down into its face in some alarm. This time there could be no mistake about it. It was neither more nor less than a pig, and she felt that it would be quite absurd for her to carry it any further. So she set the little creature down and felt quite relieved to see it trot away quietly into the wood. "If it had grown up," she said to herself, "it would have made a dreadfully ugly child. But it makes rather a handsome pig, I think." And she began thinking over other children she knew who might do very well as pigs, and was just saying to herself, "If only one knew the right way to change them," when she was a little startled by seeing the Cheshire Cat sitting on a bough of a tree a few yards off. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. It looked good-natured, she thought. Still, it had very long claws and a great many teeth, so she felt that it ought to be treated with respect. "Cheshire Puss," she began rather timidly, as she did not at all know whether it would like the name. However, it only grinned a little wider. "Come, it's pleased so far," thought Alice, and she went on. "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. "So long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk long enough." Alice felt that this could not be denied, so she tried another question. "What sort of people live about here?" "In that direction," the cat said, waving its right paw round, "lives a hatter. And in that direction," waving the other paw, "lives a March hare. Visit either you like. They're both mad." "But I don't want to go among mad people," Alice remarked. "Oh, you can't help that," said the cat. "We're all mad here. I'm mad, you're mad." "How do you know I'm mad?" said Alice. "Well, you must be," said the cat, "or you wouldn't have come here." Alice didn't think that proved it at all. However, she went on. "And how do you know that you're mad?" "To begin with," said the cat, "a dog's not mad. You grant that?" "I suppose so," said Alice. "Well, then," the cat went on, "you see, a dog growls when it's angry and wags its tail when it's pleased. Now, I growl when I'm pleased and wag my tail when I'm angry. Therefore, I'm mad." "I call it purring, not growling," said Alice. "Call it what you like," said the cat. "Do you play croquet with the Queen today?" "I should like it very much," said Alice, "but I haven't been invited yet." "You'll see me there," said the cat, and vanished. Alice was not much surprised at this. She was getting so well used to queer things happening. While she was still looking at the place where it had been, it suddenly appeared again. "By the by, what became of the baby?" said the cat. "I'd nearly forgotten to ask." "It turned into a pig," Alice answered very quietly, just as if the cat had come back in a natural way. "I thought it would," said the cat, and vanished again. Alice waited a little, half expecting to see it again, but it did not appear, and after a minute or two she walked on in the direction in which the March hare was said to live. "I've seen hatters before," she said to herself. "The March hare will be much the most interesting, and perhaps, as this is May, it won't be raving mad, at least not so mad as it was in March." As she said this, she looked up, and there was the cat again, sitting on a branch of a tree.
"Did you say pig or fig?" said the cat.
"I said pig," replied Alice, "and I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You make one quite giddy."
"All right," said the cat.
And this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of the tail and ending with the grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. "Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin," thought Alice, "but a grin without a cat. It's the most curious thing I ever saw in all my life." She had not gone much farther before she came in sight of the house of the March Hare. She thought it must be the right house, because the chimneys were shaped like ears, and the roof was thatched with fur. It was so large a house that she did not like to go nearer till she had nibbled some more of the left-hand bit of the mushroom, and raised herself to about 2 feet high. Even then she walked up towards it rather timidly, saying to herself, "Suppose it should be raving mad after all. I almost wish I'd gone to see the Hatter instead." Chapter 7. A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and talking over its head. "Very uncomfortable for the dormouse," thought Alice. "Only as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind." The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it.
No room! No room! No room! No room! No room!
They cried out when they saw Alice coming. "There's plenty of room," said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table.
"Have some wine!"
the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all round the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. "I don't see any wine," she remarked.
"There isn't any,"
said the March Hare. "And it wasn't very civil of you to offer it," said Alice angrily.
"It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited,"
said the March Hare. "I didn't know it was your table," said Alice. "It's laid for a great many more than 3. "Your hair wants cutting," said the Hatter. He'd been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. "You should learn not to make personal remarks," Alice said with some severity. "It's very rude." The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, "Why is the raven like a writing desk?" "Come, we shall have some fun now," thought Alice. "I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that," she added aloud.
"Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it?"
said the March Hare. "Exactly so," said Alice.
"Then you should say what you mean,"
the March Hare went on. "I do," Alice hastily replied. At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." "Not the same thing a bit," said the Hatter. "Why, you might just as well say I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see."
"You might just as well say," added the March Hare, "that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like."
"You might just as well say," added the Dormouse, which seemed to be talking in its sleep, "that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe." "Oh, it is the same thing with you," said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. "What day of the month is it?" he said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then, and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little and then said, "The 4th." "2 days wrong," sighed the Hatter. "I told you butter wouldn't suit the works," he added, looking angrily at the March Hare.
"It was the best butter,"
the March Hare meekly replied. "Yes, but some crumbs must have got in it as well," the Hatter grumbled. "You shouldn't have put it in with a bread knife." The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again, but he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark.
It was the best butter, you know.
Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. "What a funny watch," she remarked. "It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is."
"Why should it?" muttered the Hatter. "Does your watch tell you what year it is?"
"Of course not," Alice replied very readily, "but that's because it stays the same year for such a long time together."
"Which is just the case with mine," said the Hatter.
Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to her to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. "I don't quite understand you," she said as politely as she could.
"The Dormouse is asleep again," said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea upon its nose.
The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said, without opening its eyes,
Of course, just what I was going to remark myself." "Have you guessed the riddle yet?" the Hatter said, turning to Alice again.
"No, I give up," Alice replied. "What's the answer?"
"I haven't the slightest idea," said the Hatter.
Nor I,
said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. "I think you might do something better with the time," she said, "than wasting it in asking riddles that have no answers."
"If you knew time as well as I do," said the Hatter, "you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him."
"I don't know what you mean," said Alice.
"Of course you don't,"
the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously.
"I dare say you have never even spoke to time."
"Perhaps not," Alice cautiously replied. "But I know I have to beat time when I learn music."
"Oh, that accounts for it," said the Hatter. "He won't stand beating. Now, if you only kept on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling, 1:30, time for dinner."
"I only wish it was," the March Hare said to itself in a whisper. "Oh, that would be grand, certainly," said Alice thoughtfully. "But then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know."
"Not at first, perhaps," said the Hatter, "but you could keep it to 1:30 as long as you like."
"Is that the way you manage?" Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully.
"Not I," he replied. We quarrelled last March, just before he went mad, you know,"
pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare.
"It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing 'Twinkle, twinkle, little bats, how I wonder what you're at.' You know the song, perhaps?"
"I've heard something like it," said Alice.
"It goes on, you know," the Hatter continued, "in this way. Up above the world you fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle."
Here the Dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep.
"Twinkle, twinkle, 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 twinkle,"
and went on so long that they had to pinch it to make it stop.
"Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse," said the Hatter, "when the Queen bawled out, 'He's murdering the time! Off with his head!'"
"How dreadfully savage!" exclaimed Alice.
"And ever since that," the Hatter went on in a mournful tone, "he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now."
A bright idea came into Alice's head. "Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here?" she asked.
"Yes, that's it," said the Hatter with a sigh. "It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between whiles."
"Then you keep moving round, I suppose," said Alice.
"Exactly so," said the Hatter, "as the things get used up."
"But what happens when you come to the beginning again?" Alice ventured to ask.
suppose we change the subject.
The March Hare interrupted, yawning.
I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story.
"I'm afraid I don't know one," said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal.
Then the Dormouse shall wake up, Dormouse.
And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened its eyes.
"Oh, I wasn't asleep,"
it said in a hoarse, feeble voice.
I heard every word you fellows were saying.
Tell us the story, said the March Hare.
Oh, yes, please do, pleaded Alice.
And be quick about it, added the Hatter, or you'll be asleep again before it's done.
Once upon a time there were 3 little sisters, the Dormouse began in a great hurry, and their names were Elsie, Lacie, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well.
What did they live on?
Said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking. They lived on treacle, said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two.
They couldn't have done that, you know, Alice gently remarked. They'd have been ill.
So they were, said the Dormouse. Very ill. Alice tried a little to fancy to herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on, But why did they live at the bottom of a well?
Take some more tea,
the March Hare said to Alice very earnestly.
I've had nothing yet, Alice replied in an offended tone, so I can't take more.
You mean you can't take less? Said the Hatter. It's very easy to take more than nothing.
Nobody asked your opinion, said Alice.
Oh, who's making personal remarks now? The Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question.
Why did they live at the bottom of a well?
The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it, and then said, It was a treacle well.
There's no such thing,
Alice was beginning very angrily, but the Hatter and the March Hare went, Shh, 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 and the Dormouse sulkily remarked, If you can't be civil, you'd better finish the story for yourself.
No, please go on,
Alice said very humbly.
I won't interrupt you again. I dare say there may be one.
One, indeed, said the Dormouse indignantly. However, he consented to go on. And so these 3 little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know.
What did they draw?
Said Alice, quite forgetting her promise. Treacle, said the Dormouse, without considering at all this time.
I want a clean cup, interrupted the Hatter. Let's all move one place on.
He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously,
But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?
You can draw water out of a water well, said the Hatter. So I should think you could draw treacle out of a treacle well. Eh, stupid?
But they were in the well,
Alice said to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice this last remark.
Of course they were,
said the Dormouse.
Well, in.
This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting it. They were learning to draw, the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, for it was getting very sleepy. And they drew all manner of things, everything that begins with an M.
Why with an M?
Said Alice.
Why not?
Said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed its eyes by this time and was going off into a doze, but on being pinched by the Hatter it woke up again with a little shriek and went on. That begins with an M, such as mousetraps and the moon and memory and muchness. You know, you say things are much of a muchness. Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of a muchness?
Really, now you ask me,
said Alice, very much confused.
I don't think...
Then you shouldn't talk, said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call after her. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot.
At any rate, I'll never go there again,
said Alice as she picked her way through the wood.
It's the stupidest tea party I ever was at in all my life.
Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it.
That's very curious, she thought. But everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once.
And in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall,
and close to the little glass table. "Now I'll manage better this time," she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she set to work nibbling at the mushroom. She had kept a piece of it in her pocket till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden, among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. Chapter 8. The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them, and just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out there, Five, don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. "Seven jogged me elbow." On which Seven looked up and said, "Well, that's right, Five, always lay the blame on others." "You better not talk," said Five. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, too," said Seven. "Yeah, it is his business," said Five. "And I'll tell him it was for bringing the cooked tulip roots instead of onions." Seven flung down his brush and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," when his eye chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked round also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me, please," said Alice, a little timidly, "why you are painting those roses?" Five and Seven said nothing, but looked at Two. Two began in a low voice. "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake. And if the Queen was to find it out, we should have all our heads cut off, you know. So, you see, miss, we're doing our best before she comes to... At this moment, Five, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds and walked 2 and 2, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in hand, in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the white rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the knave of hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And last of all this grand procession came the king and the queen of hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, thought she, if people had all to lie down on their faces so that they couldn't see it? So she stood where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her. And the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the knave of hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot!" said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards, after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "Und who are these?" said the Queen to the 3 gardeners, who were lying round the rose tree, for you see, as they were lying on their faces and the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack, she could not tell whether they were gardeners or soldiers or courtiers or 3 of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, began screaming, "Off with her head! Off with..." "Nonsense!"
said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Consider, oh, my dear, she's only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the knave, "Turn them over!" The knave did so very carefully with one foot. "Get up!" said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice, and the three gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King, the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave off that!" screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy!" And then, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your Majesty," said two in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke. "We were trying—" "I see," said the Queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. "Off with their heads!" And the procession moved on, three of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The three soldiers wandered about for a minute or two looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the Queen. "Their heads are gone! If it please your Majesty!" the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right!" shouted the Queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on, then!" roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the white rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say, 'What a pity'?" the rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, 'What for?'" "Well, she boxed the Queen's ears," the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush," the rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the Queen said—" "Get to your places!" shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she had got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself round and look up in her face with such a puzzled expression that she could not help bursting out laughing. And when she had got its head down and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once, without waiting for turns, quarrelling all the while and fighting for the hedgehogs, and in a very short time the Queen was in a furious passion and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head!" or "Off with her head!" about once in a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy, to be sure. She had not as yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew that it might happen any minute. And then, thought she, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way of escape and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin. And she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat."
Now I shall have somebody to talk to.
How are you getting on?
said the cat as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with.
Alice waited till the eyes appeared, and then nodded.
It's no use speaking to it, she thought, till its ears have come, or at least one of them.
In another minute, the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared.
I don't think they play at all fairly,
Alice began in a rather complaining tone.
and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak. And they don't seem to have any rules in particular, at least if there are, nobody attends to them, and you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground, and I should have croquetted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming.
How do you like the Queen?
said the cat in a low voice.
Not at all,
said Alice.
She's so extremely...
Just then she noticed that the Queen was close behind her listening, so she went on,
likely to win, that it's hardly worthwhile finishing the game.
The Queen smiled and passed on.
Who are you talking to?
said the King, coming up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity.
It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire cat, said Alice. Allow me to introduce it.
I don't like the look of it at all,
said the King.
However, it may kiss my hand, if it likes.
I'd rather not, the cat remarked.
Don't be impertinent,
said the King.
And don't look at me like that.
He got behind Alice as he spoke.
A cat may look at a king,
said Alice.
I've read that in some book, but I don't remember where.
Well, it must be removed,
said the King very decidedly, and he called to the Queen, who was passing at the moment.
My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed.
The Queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small.
Off with his head,
she said, without even looking round.
I'll fetch the executioner myself,
said the King eagerly, and he hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the Queen's voice in the distance screaming with passion. She had already heard her sentence 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of things at all, as the game was in such confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went off in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croquetting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of way to fly up into a tree. By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over and both the hedgehogs were out of sight.
But it doesn't matter much, thought Alice, as all the archers are gone from this side of the ground.
So she tucked it away under her arm that it might not escape again, and went back to have a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected round it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the King, and the Queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent, and looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to by all 3 to settle the question, and they repeated their arguments to her, though as they all spoke at once, she found it very hard to make out exactly what they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from, and that he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The King's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. The Queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed all round. It was this last remark that had made the whole party look so grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say but,
"It belongs to the Duchess. You'd better ask her about it."
She's in prison,
the Queen said to the executioner.
Fetch her here.
And the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he had come back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared. So the King and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game.
Chapter 9. The Mock Turtle's Story.
"You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dull thing," said the Duchess, as she tucked her arm affectionately into Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was very glad to find her in such a pleasant temper, and thought to herself that perhaps it was only the pepper that had made her so savage when they met in the kitchen. "When I'm a duchess," she said to herself, not in a very hopeful tone, though, "I won't have any pepper in my kitchen at all. Soup does very well without. Maybe it's always pepper that makes people hot-tempered," she went on, very much pleased at having found out a new kind of rule, "and vinegar that makes them sour, and chamomile that makes them bitter, and barley sugar and such things that make children sweet-tempered. I only wish people knew that, then they wouldn't be so stingy about it, you know." She had quite forgotten the Duchess by this time, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear. "You're thinking about something, my dear, and that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of that is, but I shall remember it in a bit." "Perhaps it hasn't one," Alice ventured to remark. "Oh, tut, tut, child," said the Duchess. "Everything's got a moral, if only you can find it." And she squeezed herself up closer to Alice's side as she spoke. Alice did not much like her keeping so close to her, first, because the Duchess was very ugly, and secondly, because she was exactly the right height to rest her chin on Alice's shoulder, and it was an uncomfortably sharp chin. However, she did not like to be rude, so she bore it as well as she could. "The game's going on rather better now," she said, by way of keeping up the conversation a little. "'Tis so," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is, oh, 'tis love that makes the world go round." "Somebody said," Alice whispered, "that it's done by everybody minding their own business." "Ah, well, it means much the same thing," said the Duchess, digging her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder as she added, "and the moral of that is, take care of the sense, and the sounds will take care of themselves." How fond she is of finding morals in things, Alice thought to herself. "I dare say you're wondering why I don't put my arm around your waist," the Duchess said after a pause. "The reason is that I'm doubtful about the temper of your flamingo. Shall I try the experiment?" "He might bite," Alice cautiously replied, not feeling at all anxious to have the experiment tried. "Very true," said the Duchess. "Flamingos and mustard both bite. And the moral of that is, birds of a feather flock together." "Only mustard isn't a bird," Alice remarked. "Right as usual," said the Duchess. "What a clear way you have of putting things." "It's a mineral, I think," said Alice. "Of course it is," said the Duchess, who seemed ready to agree with everything that Alice had said. "There's a large mustard mine near here, and the moral of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours." "Oh, I know," exclaimed Alice, who had not attended to this last remark. "It's a vegetable. It doesn't look like one, but it is." "I quite agree with you," said the Duchess. "And the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be. Or, if you'd like it put more simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others, that what you were or might have been was not otherwise than what you had been would have appeared to them to be otherwise." "I think I should understand that better," Alice said very politely, "if I had it written down, but I can't quite follow it as you say it." "Oh, that's nothing to what I could say if I chose," the Duchess replied in a pleased tone. "Pray don't trouble yourself to say it any longer than that," said Alice. "Oh, don't talk about trouble," said the Duchess. "I make you a present of everything I've said as yet." "A cheap sort of present," thought Alice. "I'm glad people don't give birthday presents like that." But she did not venture to say it out loud. "Thinking again?" the Duchess asked, with another dig of her sharp little chin. "I've a right to think," said Alice sharply, for she was beginning to feel a little worried. "Just about as much right," said the Duchess, "as pigs have to fly. And the more... But here, to Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away, even in the middle of her favourite word, moral, and the arm that was linked into hers began to tremble. Alice looked up, and there stood the Queen in front of them, with her arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm. "Fine day, Your Majesty," the Duchess began in a low, weak voice.
Now I give you fair warning, shouted the Queen, stamping on the ground as she spoke. Either you or your head must be off, and that in about half no time. Take your choice.
The Duchess took her choice and was gone in a moment.
Let's go on with the game,
the Queen said to Alice, and Alice was too much frightened to say a word, but slowly followed her back to the croquet ground. The other guests had taken advantage of the Queen's absence and were resting in the shade. However, the moment they saw her, they hurried back to the game, the Queen merely remarking that a moment's delay would cost them their lives. All the time they were playing, the Queen never left off quarrelling with the other players and shouting,
"Off with his head! Off with her head!"
Those whom she sentenced were taken into custody by the soldiers, who of course had to leave off being archers to do this, so that by the end of half an hour or so there were no archers left, and all the players except the King, the Queen, and Alice were in custody and under sentence of execution. Then the Queen left off, quite out of breath, and said to Alice, "Have you seen the mock turtle yet?" "No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a mock turtle is."
"It's the thing mock turtle soup is made from," said the Queen.
"I never saw one or heard of one," said Alice.
"Come on, then," said the Queen, "and he shall tell you his history."
As they walked off together, Alice heard the King say in a low voice to the company generally,
"You are all, pardoned?"
"Come, that's a good thing," she said to herself, for she had felt quite unhappy at the number of executions the Queen had ordered. They very soon came upon a griffin lying fast asleep in the sun. If you don't know what a griffin is, look at the picture.
"Up, lazy thing," said the Queen, "and take this young lady to see the mock turtle and to hear his history. I must go back and see after some executions I've ordered."
And she walked off, leaving Alice alone with the griffin. Alice did not quite like the look of the creature, but on the whole she thought it would be quite as safe to stay with it as to go after that savage Queen, so she waited. The griffin sat up and rubbed its eyes, then it watched the Queen till she was out of sight. Then it chuckled.
"What fun!"
said the griffin, half to itself, half to Alice. "What is the fun?" said Alice.
"Why, she," said the griffin. "It's all her fancy, that. They never executes nobody, you know. Come on!"
"Everybody says, 'Come on,' here," thought Alice, as she went slowly after it. "I never was so ordered about before in all my life, never." They had not gone far before they saw the mock turtle in the distance, sitting sad and lonely on a little ledge of rock, and as they came nearer, Alice could hear him sighing as if his heart would break. She pitied him deeply. "What is his sorrow?" she asked the griffin, and the griffin answered very nearly in the same words as before.
"It's all his fancy, that. He hasn't got no sorrow, you know. Come on!"
So they went up to the mock turtle, who looked at them with large eyes full of tears, but said nothing.
"This here young lady," said the griffin, "she wants for to know your history, she do."
I'll tell it her,
said the mock turtle in a deep, hollow tone.
"Sit down, both of you, and don't speak a word till I'm finished."
So they sat down, and nobody spoke for some minutes. Alice thought to herself, "I don't see how he can ever finish if he doesn't begin." But she waited patiently.
"Once,"
said the mock turtle at last with a deep sigh,
"I was a real turtle."
These words were followed by a very long silence, broken only by an occasional exclamation of from the griffin, and the constant, heavy sobbing of the mock turtle. Alice was very nearly getting up and saying, "Thank you, sir, for your interesting story," but she could not help thinking there must be more to come, so she sat still and said nothing.
when we were little, the Mock Turtle went on at last, more calmly, though still sobbing a little now and then, we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise.
Why did you call him Tortoise, if he wasn't one?
Alice asked. We called him Tortoise because he taught us, said the Mock Turtle angrily. Really, you are very dull.
You ought to be ashamed of yourself for asking such a simple question, added the Gryphon, and then they both sat silent and looked at poor Alice, who felt ready to sink into the earth. At last the Gryphon said to the Mock Turtle, "Drive on, old fellow, don't be all day about it." And he went on in these words,
Yes, we went to school in the sea. No, you mayn't believe it.
"I never said I didn't," interrupted Alice. "You did," said the Mock Turtle. "Hold your tongue," added the Gryphon before Alice could speak again. The Mock Turtle went on.
We had the best of educations. In fact, we went to school every day.
I've been to a day school, too,
said Alice.
You needn't be so proud as all that.
With extras?
Asked the Mock Turtle a little anxiously.
Yes, said Alice. We learn French and music.
And washing?
Said the Mock Turtle.
Certainly not, said Alice indignantly.
Ah, then yours wasn't a really good school,
said the Mock Turtle in a tone of great relief.
Now at ours they had at the end of the bill French, music, and washing. Extra.
You couldn't have wanted it much, said Alice, living at the bottom of the sea.
I couldn't afford to learn it, said the Mock Turtle with a sigh. I only took the regular course.
What was that? Inquired Alice.
Reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with, the Mock Turtle replied, and then the different branches of arithmetic, ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision.
I never heard of uglification, Alice ventured to say. What is it? The Gryphon lifted up both its paws in surprise. Never heard of uglifying? It exclaimed. You know what to beautify is, I suppose?
Oh, yes, said Alice doubtfully. It means to make anything prettier.
Well, then, the Gryphon went on, if you don't know what to uglify is, you are a simpleton. Alice did not feel encouraged to ask any more questions about it, so she turned to the Mock Turtle and said,
What else had you to learn?
Well, there was mystery,
the Mock Turtle replied, counting off the subjects on his flappers.
Mystery, ancient and modern, with seaography, then drawling. The drawling master was an old conger eel that used to come once a week. He taught us drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils.
What was that like?
Said Alice.
Well, I can't show it to you myself, the Mock Turtle said. I'm too stiff, and the Gryphon never learnt it.
Hadn't time, said the Gryphon. I went to the classical master, though. He was an old crab, he was.
I never went to him,
the Mock Turtle said with a sigh.
He taught laughing and grief, they used to say.
Oh, so he did. So he did, said the Gryphon, sighing in his turn, and both creatures hid their faces in their paws.
And how many hours a day did you do lessons? Said Alice in a hurry to change the subject.
10 hours the first day, said the Mock Turtle, 9 the next, and so on.
What a curious plan, exclaimed Alice. That's the reason they're called lessons, the Gryphon remarked, because they lesson from day to day. This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little bit before she made her next remark.
Then the 11th day must have been a holiday.
Of course it was, said the Mock Turtle.
And how did you manage on the 12th? Alice went on eagerly. That's enough about lessons, the Gryphon interrupted in a very decided tone. Tell her something about the games now.
Chapter 10. The Lobster Quadrille.
The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flapper across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a minute or two sobs choked his voice.
Same as if he had a bone in his throat, said the Gryphon.
And it set to work shaking him and punching him in the back. At last the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and with tears running down his cheeks, he went on again.
You may not have lived much under the sea.
I haven't, said Alice.
And perhaps you were never even introduced to a lobster.
Alice began to say, I once tasted, but checked herself hastily and said, No, never.
So you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is.
No, indeed, said Alice. What sort of a dance is it?
Why, said the Gryphon, you first form into a line along the seashore.
2 lines, cried the Mock Turtle. Seals, turtles, salmon, and so on. And then when you've cleared all the jellyfish out of the way...
That generally takes some time, interrupted the Gryphon.
You advance twice.
Each with a lobster as a partner, cried the Gryphon.
Of course, the Mock Turtle said. Advance twice, set to partners.
Change lobsters and retire in same order, continued the Gryphon.
And then, you know, the Mock Turtle went on, you throw
the lobsters, shouted the Gryphon with a bound into the air,
as far out to sea as you can.
Swim after them, screamed the Gryphon.
Turn a somersault in the sea,
cried the Mock Turtle, capering wildly about. Change lobsters again, yelled the Gryphon at the top of his voice.
Back to land again, and that's all the first figure,
said the Mock Turtle, suddenly dropping his voice, and the 2 creatures who had been jumping about like mad things all this time sat down again very sadly and quietly and looked at Alice.
It must be a very pretty dance,
said Alice timidly.
Would you like to see a little of it?
said the Mock Turtle.
Very much indeed,
said Alice.
Come, let's try the first figure,
said the Mock Turtle to the Gryphon.
We can do it without lobsters, you know. Which shall sing?
Oh, you sing, said the Gryphon. I've forgotten the words. So they began solemnly dancing round and round Alice, every now and then treading on her toes when they passed too close, and waving their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this very slowly and sadly.
Will you walk a little faster, said a whiting to a snail. There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They're waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, won't you join the dance? You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us with the lobsters out to sea. But the snail replied, too far, and gave a look askance. Said he thanked the whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not, would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not, could not join the dance. What matters it how far we go, his scaly friend replied. There is another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off from England, the nearer is to France. Then turn not pale, beloved snail, but come and join the dance. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, won't you join the dance?
Thank you. It's a very interesting dance to watch,
said Alice, feeling very glad that it was over at last.
And I do so like that curious song about the whiting.
Oh, as to the whiting, said the Mock Turtle, you've seen them, of course.
Yes, said Alice, I've often seen them at Din.
She checked herself hastily.
I don't know where Den may be, said the Mock Turtle, but if you've seen them so often, of course you know what they're like.
I believe so, Alice replied thoughtfully. They have their tails in their mouths, and they're all over crumbs.
Oh, you're wrong about the crumbs, said the Mock Turtle. Crumbs would all wash off in the sea, but they have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is...
Here the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes.
Tell her about the reason and all that,
he said to the Gryphon.
The reason is, said the Gryphon, that they would go with the lobsters to the dance, so they got thrown out to sea, so they had to fall a long way, so they got their tails fast in their mouths, so they couldn't get them out again. That's all.
Thank you, said Alice. It's very interesting. I never knew so much about whiting before.
I can tell you more than that if you like, said the Gryphon. Do you know why it is called a whiting?
I never thought about it, said Alice. Why?
It does the boots and shoes, the Gryphon replied very solemnly.
Alice was thoroughly puzzled. Does the boots and shoes, she repeated in a wondering tone.
Why, what are your shoes done with? Said the Gryphon. I mean, what makes them so shiny?
Alice looked down at them and considered a little before she gave her answer. Well, they're done with blacking, I believe.
Boots and shoes under the sea, the Gryphon went on in a deep voice, are done with whiting. Now you know.
And what are they made of?
Alice asked in a tone of great curiosity. Soles and eels, of course, the Gryphon replied rather impatiently. Any shrimp could have told you that.
If I'd been the whiting, said Alice, whose thoughts were still running on the song, I'd have said to the porpoise, keep back, please, we don't want you with us.
They were obliged to have him with them, the Mock Turtle said. No wise fish should go anywhere without a porpoise.
Wouldn't it really? Said Alice in a tone of great surprise.
Of course not, said the Mock Turtle. Why, if a fish came to me and told me he was going a journey, I should say, with what purpose?
Don't you mean purpose? Said Alice.
I mean what I say,
the Mock Turtle replied in an offended tone, and the Gryphon added, Come, let's hear some of your adventures.
I could tell you my adventures beginning from this morning, said Alice a little timidly, but it's no use going back to yesterday because I was a different person then.
Explain all that, said the Mock Turtle.
No, the adventures first, said the Gryphon in an impatient tone. Explanations take such a dreadful time.
So Alice began telling them her adventures from the time when she first saw the White Rabbit. She was a little nervous about it just at first. The two creatures got so close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide. But she gained courage as she went on. Her listeners were perfectly quiet till she got to the part about her repeating, "You are old, Father William," to the caterpillar, and the words coming all different. And then the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said,
"That's very curious."
"It's all about as curious as it can be," said the Gryphon.
"It all came different,"
the Mock Turtle repeated thoughtfully.
"I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin."
He looked at the Gryphon as if he thought it had some kind of authority over Alice.
"Stand up and repeat. 'Tis the voice of the sluggard," said the Gryphon.
How the creatures order one about and make one repeat lessons, thought Alice. I might just as well be at school at once. However, she got up and began to repeat it, but her head was so full of the lobster quadrille that she hardly knew what she was saying, and the words came very queer indeed. "'Tis the voice of the lobster. I heard him declare, 'You have baked me too brown, I must sugar my hair.' As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons and turns out his toes. When the sands are all dry, he is gay as a lark, and will talk in contemptuous tones of the shark. But when the tide rises and sharks are around, his voice has a timid and tremulous sound." "That's different from what I used to say when I was a child," said the Gryphon.
Well, I never heard it before, said the Mock Turtle, but it sounds uncommon nonsense.
Alice said nothing. She had sat down with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen in a natural way again.
I should like to have it explained, said the Mock Turtle.
She can't explain it, said the Gryphon hastily. Go on with the next verse.
But about his toes, the Mock Turtle persisted. How could he turn them out with his nose, you know?
It's the first position in dancing, Alice said, but she was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing and longed to change the subject. Go on with the next verse, the Gryphon repeated. It begins, I passed by his garden. Alice did not dare to disobey, though she felt sure it would come all wrong, and she went on in a trembling voice.
I passed by his garden and marked with one eye how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie. The panther took pie crust and gravy and meat, while the owl had the dish as its share of the treat. When the pie was all finished, the owl, as a boon, was kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, while the panther received knife and fork with a growl, and concluded the banquet by...
What is the use of repeating all that stuff?
The Mock Turtle interrupted.
If you don't explain it as you go on, it's by far the most confusing thing I ever heard.
Yes, I think you'd better leave off, said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so. Shall we try another figure of the lobster quadrille? The Gryphon went on. Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you another song?
Oh, a song, please, if the Mock Turtle would be so kind,
Alice replied so eagerly that the Gryphon said in a rather offended tone,
No accounting for tastes.
Sing her turtle soup, will you, old fellow? The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and began, in a voice choked with sobs, to sing this.
Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. Who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, beautiful soup, soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup, beautiful soup. Who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give all else for 2 pennyworth only of beautiful soup? Pennyworth only of beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, beautiful soup, soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup.
Chorus again, cried the Gryphon, and the Mock Turtle had just begun to repeat it when a cry of, "The trial's beginning!" was heard in the distance. "Come on!" cried the Gryphon, and taking Alice by the hand, it hurried off without waiting for the end of the song. "What trial is it?" Alice panted as she ran, but the Gryphon only answered, "Come on!" and ran the faster, while more and more faintly came, carried on the breeze that followed them, the melancholy words, "Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup."